The light flickers as Richard enters his study, his evening routine unchanged for decades. Settling into his worn leather chair, he notices the envelope. Margaret's handwriting, but addressed to someone else, misplaced among their bills. His weathered hands tremble as he opens it, the familiar scent of lemon polish mixing with the evening coffee, cooling beside him. The grandfather clock, his father's legacy, ticks accusingly as his eyes scan the words. Love declarations not meant for him. Has betrayal ever blindsided you after decades of trust? Share below, like if Richard's pain resonates, follow to witness his fight for dignity. Tears blur the letter's edge, dropping onto the polished desk where he's balanced their books for 45 years. A lifetime of trust dissolves in seconds. His wedding ring catches the lamplight as his fist clenches, memories of anniversary toasts flashing bitterly through his mind. A soft sob escapes as footsteps approach from the hallway. Richard paused at the threshold of his study, hand hesitating on the light switch. The familiar flicker. He'd been meaning to replace that bulb for weeks now. Settling into the worn leather chair that had witnessed 45 years of household accounting, he opened the weekly ledger with practiced precision. The grandfather clock, his father's legacy, ticked steadily in the corner, its rhythm a comfort amid the evening silence. His fingers traced down the column of numbers, then stopped. The joint account balance was off by nearly $4,000. Not a small discrepancy, not for a man who'd balanced books to the penny his entire career. Richard removed his reading glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and reached for the bank statement in the drawer. The moment his eyes caught the Mayflower Hotel charge, his breath caught. That was the weekend Margaret had visited her sister. The weekend she'd canceled their anniversary dinner, claiming Clara had fallen ill. "No sense in both of us missing out," she'd said, with a quick kiss goodbye. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he opened the desk drawer, retrieving 3 months of statements he'd filed away. The coffee beside him had gone cold, its aroma mingling with the lemon polish Margaret always used on his desk. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as he spread the papers before him, creating a timeline of betrayal. Same hotel, different dates. Restaurant charges for 2 at places he'd never visited. His accountant's mind instantly calculated patterns, while his husband's heart struggled to process their meaning. Not Margaret. The thought formed and dissolved in equal measure. 45 years didn't end in hotel receipts and balance discrepancies. Did it? His eyes drifted to the silver-framed photograph on his desk, their 40th anniversary celebration, surrounded by Julie and the grandchildren. Margaret's smile then had seemed so genuine. His vision blurred as the first tear escaped, landing with precision on the hotel receipt date, the same day they'd planned to celebrate 45 years together. A soft, involuntary sound escaped him, something between a gasp and a sob. Richard pressed his hand against his chest, feeling the unfamiliar ache spreading there. All those years of careful planning for their retirement, their future. What else didn't he know? What else had he missed? He removed his glasses completely, wiping his eyes with the monogrammed handkerchief from his retirement party. The accountant in him wouldn't allow tears to damage evidence. Evidence. The word felt foreign when applied to his marriage. As he carefully refolded the handkerchief, his attention caught on something odd, a smudge on the Mayflower receipt. The type of ink inconsistency his trained eye couldn't miss. Something about the dates seemed altered. The gentle knock at his study door startled him. Richard quickly gathered the statements, sliding them beneath his ledger as the door began to open. "Dinner in 10 minutes," Margaret called, her voice carrying the same warmth it always had. "Everything all right in here?" Richard cleared his throat, steadying his voice. "Just finishing up, dear." But as she closed the door, his fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. Everything was not all right. Not by a long shot. The door closed with a soft click as Margaret's footsteps retreated down the hallway. Richard exhaled slowly, his reflection in the darkening window showing a man he barely recognized. Shoulders slumped, eyes reddened, mouth drawn tight against words that wanted to escape. Not yet. Not until he was certain. He carefully unfolded his handkerchief again, dabbing at the moisture still threatening his eyes. All those years at the firm, he'd prided himself on never letting emotions cloud his judgment. Facts before feelings, he'd told countless junior accountants. Now that mantra would serve a purpose he'd never imagined. Richard turned back to his desk, pulling a fresh legal pad from the drawer. His hand steadied as he wrote the date at the top, then began listing suspicious transactions in his precise, slanted script. 3 separate visits to the Mayflower in 6 months. Dinners at Castelli's, where they'd gone for their 30th anniversary, a jewelry purchase from Harrington's that had never appeared around Margaret's neck or wrists. "Marking your territory in our memories," he whispered, the words bitter on his tongue. As patterns emerged through the methodical documentation, Richard felt something shift inside him, grief giving way to a familiar analytical focus. This was a problem to solve, a discrepancy to trace to its source. His expertise hadn't vanished with retirement. If anything, age had honed it. From the kitchen came the sound of Margaret humming, that Sinatra tune she'd always loved. The melody now felt like mockery, the soundtrack to a performance he'd watched for years without seeing the truth behind it. The spreadsheet before him told a different story than the one they'd supposedly lived together. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard as he prepared to save his findings. Password protected, of course. What would she never guess? His fingers moved automatically. JULY 251979, their wedding date. The irony wasn't lost on him as he confirmed the protection. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, reminding Richard of dinner. He would go downstairs, sit across from her, and pretend. The thought turned his stomach, but the accountant in him knew that revealing his hand too soon would be a tactical error. He needed more information. He needed an ally. Richard opened his leather-bound address book, the pages soft with age and use. He ran his finger down the S page until he found it, Finnegan Sullivan. They hadn't spoken regularly since retirement 5 years ago, just Christmas cards and the occasional lunch. But if there was anyone who combined discretion with financial acumen, it was Finn. As he reached for the phone, Richard noticed a familiar car pulling into the driveway next door. Old Mr. Beckman, watering his roses despite the evening chill. 83, and still tending the garden he'd planted with his wife 30 years ago. Richard had always admired that dedication. Now he wondered if it had been devotion or delusion. The phone felt heavy in his hand. Once he made this call, there would be no going back, no pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen, no maintaining the comfortable fiction of their marriage. "Richard, dinner's ready," Margaret called up the stairs, her voice carrying the same warmth it always had. He set the phone down, closing the ledger with care. "Coming, dear," he replied, his voice steadier than he'd expected. Tomorrow, he would call Finn. Tonight, he would watch his wife for clues he'd been too trusting to see before. As he stood, Richard straightened his shoulders and adjusted his sweater. 45 years of marriage might be crumbling around him, but he wouldn't slouch through the ruins. The corner booth at Mabel's diner sat far from the windows, offering the privacy Richard needed. He'd arrived 20 minutes early, organizing his folder of evidence with the same care he'd once given year-end reports. His coffee had already been refilled twice when the bell above the door announced Finn's arrival. Time had added weight to Finn's frame and silver to his hair, but the shrewd eyes were unchanged, assessing, calculating, missing nothing. Those eyes now widened slightly at Richard's appearance. "You look like hell, Rich," Finn said by way of greeting, sliding into the booth. Richard attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good to see you too, Finn." The waitress appeared with fresh coffee, disappearing again with the practiced discretion of someone who'd served countless difficult conversations over decades. Rain began to patter against the windows, providing a gentle soundtrack to the heavy silence between old friends. "So," Finn said finally, stirring sugar into his cup, "this isn't about tax season or golf handicaps." Richard's hand hovered over the folder, hesitating. Speaking the words aloud would make them real in a way that spreadsheets and bank statements hadn't. He cleared his throat. "It's Margaret," he began, and was surprised to feel his voice catch on her name. 45 years condensed into 2 syllables that suddenly felt foreign on his tongue. "She's—" The words stuck again. Richard pushed the folder across the table instead, letting the evidence speak for him. Finn opened it, his expression shifting from concern to concentration as he reviewed the meticulous documentation. Richard had arranged everything chronologically: hotel receipts, restaurant charges, timeline discrepancies, suspicious withdrawals, each piece insignificant alone, damning in aggregate. "You're sure?" Finn asked without looking up. Richard nodded, then realized his friend's attention was on the papers. "Yes," he said, the single syllable heavy with certainty and grief. Finn flipped to the last page, where Richard had noted a pattern of department funding requests at Margaret's company that aligned suspiciously with the dates of her sister visits. "Adam Carlyle," Finn read aloud. "That name means something to you?" Her colleague. Project manager. 15 years younger. Each fact delivered with the precision of an accountant, belying the tremor Richard felt building inside. "She mentions him at dinner sometimes." "Brilliant, apparently?" Richard reached for his coffee cup, grateful for something to hold. The diner around them continued its mundane rhythm: clinking silverware, murmured conversations, the hiss of the grill. Normal life continuing while his shattered. 45 years, Finn," he said suddenly, his voice breaking. 45 years, and I find out from a hotel receipt." The first tear fell before he could stop it, landing on the table between them. Richard turned toward the window, embarrassed by the display. Men of their generation didn't weep in public places, even before old friends. Finn pretended to study the documents, allowing Richard his dignity. After a moment, he spoke quietly. "This goes beyond an affair, Rich. These financial patterns," he tapped the company expenditure page, "suggest misappropriation, potentially serious." Richard hadn't expected that. Personal betrayal was one wound. Professional misconduct added another dimension entirely. He thought of their retirement accounts, their investments, the home they'd spent decades paying for. "How bad?" he asked, accountant to accountant. "Can't say without more information," Finn replied, professional instincts engaging. "But if they're using company funds to finance their activities, there could be legal implications." Richard stared at his reflection in the rain-streaked window. An old man looking back, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been yesterday. When had that happened? When had he become someone who could be dismissed, deceived, discarded? "There's something else," Finn said, his tone changing. "Been hearing rumors about budget irregularities in the financial services division at Margaret's company. Nothing concrete, but—" Richard turned back sharply. "That's her department." "Yes," Finn nodded, closing the folder. "Which means this might be bigger than you initially thought." The implications settled between them like a physical weight. Not just a marriage in jeopardy, but potentially their financial security, Margaret's career, their reputation in the community. "What would you do?" Richard asked quietly. Finn considered for a long moment, rain drumming steadily outside. "I'd gather more evidence," he said finally, "and I'd protect my assets while doing it." Richard nodded, feeling the familiar clarity that came with having a plan. The emotion wasn't gone, it sat heavy in his chest, but now it had purpose. As they left the diner, Finn clapped a hand on Richard's shoulder. "You're not in this alone, Rich. Remember that." Driving home through the rain, Richard rehearsed normalcy in his mind. Dinner conversations, television programs, bedtime routines. All the domestic choreography he would continue while secretly dismantling the foundation upon which it all rested. The betrayal of 45 years deserved nothing less than a meticulous response. And if there was one thing Richard Harmon knew, it was meticulous. Richard adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror before exiting his car. The parking garage at Consolidated Financial Services felt both familiar and foreign. He'd picked Margaret up here countless times, but had never entered with purpose of his own, certainly not a purpose like today's. "Just dropping off lunch for my wife," he told the security guard with a practiced smile, holding up the insulated bag that concealed his real objective. The guard, Walt according to his nameplate, nodded with the easy recognition of a man who'd seen Richard before, though they'd never formally met. "Mrs. Harmon's on 14, Walt offered helpfully. "You need a visitor's badge?" "Please," Richard replied, maintaining the pleasant facade that had become second nature over the past 2 weeks. Each "good morning" to Margaret, each kiss on the cheek, each mundane conversation about dinner plans. All performances disguising the meticulous investigation consuming his private hours. The elevator ascended smoothly, carrying him toward the financial services division where Margaret had worked for the past 18 years. Executive Administrative Director, she was called now, a title that gave her oversight of department budgets and expenditure approvals. The significance of that authority had taken on new meaning since his conversation with Finn. Richard stepped out onto the 14th floor, visitor badge clipped to his jacket pocket. The reception area bustled with the efficient energy of corporate finance, young professionals moving with purpose, the gentle hum of computers, phones ringing in distant offices. None of them paid much attention to an older gentleman with a lunch bag. "Can I help you?" asked the receptionist, a young woman with a professional smile. "Margaret Harmon," Richard replied, "just dropping off her lunch. She forgot it this morning." The lie came easier than he'd expected. "Oh, Mrs. Harmon is in a budget meeting right now." The receptionist checked her computer. "Conference room C. Should be done in about 20 minutes. You're welcome to wait, Mr. Harmon." He thanked her, taking a seat in the reception area with a clear view of both the hallway and the row of offices beyond. His eyes casually scanned the environment, noting name plaques on doors. Adam Carlyle, project manager, read one near the corner. A corner office with glass walls currently empty of its occupant. Richard opened a magazine from the coffee table, pretending to read while his mind calculated. If Margaret was in a budget meeting and Adam's office was empty— The receptionist's phone rang, pulling her attention away. Richard waited until she was fully engaged in the call, then rose casually, lunch bag in hand, and walked with purpose toward the hallway marked Accounting Department. No one questioned an older man who moved with confidence. That was one advantage of age in corporate settings. People assumed you belonged there if you acted like it. Richard followed signs to the public records room, a space he knew would exist in any financial institution. The room was empty except for computer terminals and filing cabinets. As a publicly traded company, Consolidated maintained certain records accessible to shareholders, which Richard was, in a small way, through their investment portfolio. Nothing he was doing was technically unauthorized. He seated himself at a terminal, logging in as a public user. Years of accounting work made navigating the system intuitive. Within minutes, he had accessed departmental budget summaries for the Financial Services Division, focusing on project allocations for the past year. There it was, Project Mayfair, overseen by A. Carlyle, with M. Harmon listed as budget approver. The same project Finn had mentioned hearing rumors about. Richard exported the public data to his email, then continued searching. "Sir, can I help you with something?" Richard turned to find a young man in a company ID badge watching him with mild suspicion. "Just researching some investment opportunities," Richard replied smoothly. "My financial advisor recommended looking at Consolidated's project growth areas." The young man seemed satisfied with this explanation. "Let me know if you need any assistance. The public terminals are sometimes a bit confusing for—" He hesitated. "For old folks like me?" Richard finished with a disarming smile. "I appreciate that. I was actually just finishing up." After the young man left, Richard quickly located one more crucial piece of information, the company directory. He noted Adam Carlyle's home address before logging out of the system. As he left the records room, voices from the nearby conference room indicated a meeting ending. Richard quickened his pace slightly, rounding the corner just as Margaret emerged with several colleagues. Her surprise at seeing him appeared genuine. "Richard, what are you doing here?" "You forgot your lunch," he said, holding up the bag. "Thought I'd save you from cafeteria food." "That's so thoughtful." She kissed his cheek, introducing him to her colleagues. Richard shook hands, smiled, exchanged pleasantries, all while noticing Adam Carlyle among the group, watching the interaction with barely concealed discomfort. "Adam, have you met my husband?" Margaret asked, making the introduction with perfect composure. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure," Adam replied, extending his hand. Younger, as Richard had known, attractive in the polished way of corporate climbers. The handshake firm, but quick to withdraw. "Margaret speaks highly of your work on Project Mayfair," Richard said, watching both their faces carefully. A flicker of something, alarm, surprise, passed between them before being masked by professional smiles. "It's been a team effort," Adam replied smoothly. "Your wife's guidance has been invaluable." The double meaning wasn't lost on Richard. His jaw tightened briefly before he forced another smile. "I'm sure it has." The group dispersed, Margaret taking the lunch bag with a promise to call before heading home. Richard made his way back to the elevator, outwardly composed while fury built inside him. The casual way they'd stood there, making small talk, introducing spouses, as if they hadn't violated every trust, personal and professional. In his car, Richard finally allowed his carefully maintained facade to crack. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, a single, strangled sound of rage escaping before he regained control. He started the engine, checking his watch. Plenty of time to drive past Adam Carlyle's address before meeting Finn. The investigation was deepening, expanding beyond his marriage into something potentially far more serious. He thought of Margaret's smile as she'd introduced Adam, the practiced ease of her deception. 45 years, and he'd never truly known her at all. The park bench felt cold beneath Richard, despite the afternoon sun filtering through spring leaves. He'd chosen this spot, 3 blocks from their home but seldom visited, to make the phone call he'd been dreading. The conversation with Julie had gone exactly as he'd feared. "Dad, are you sure about this?" "It sounds, I don't know, far-fetched." His daughter's voice had carried that particular tone, the one used for elderly parents who might be confused or overreacting. "Mom's been working late because of that big project. You know how she gets when she's stressed." "Julie, I've seen the evidence. The receipts, the hotel receipts could mean anything," she'd interrupted. "Maybe she needed somewhere quiet to work. Or maybe she's planning a surprise for your anniversary." Richard had almost laughed at that, a bitter, hollow sound that thankfully never escaped his throat. Their anniversary had passed 3 weeks ago with a perfunctory dinner and a card. Margaret had claimed exhaustion from work, begging off the weekend trip he'd suggested. Now he knew why. "Just don't do anything hasty, okay?" Julie had concluded. "You guys have been together forever. This is probably just a misunderstanding." The call had ended with her promising to visit soon, her tone suggesting she needed to check on him rather than investigate her mother. Richard stared at the silent phone in his hand, feeling the weight of dismissal. His own daughter thought he was a confused old man, inventing conspiracy theories about his faithful wife. He tucked the phone away and pulled out the folder of evidence he'd been compiling. 2 weeks of meticulous investigation had yielded a disturbing pattern. Financial improprieties at Consolidated that coincided precisely with Margaret and Adam's affair timeline. Project Mayfair appeared to be both legitimate business and convenient cover, with inflated budget allocations funding weekend retreats disguised as project planning sessions. Richard had documented it all with the precision of a forensic accountant. The case was solid. He'd even driven past Adam's suburban home, noting the luxury cars in the driveway that seemed excessive for a project manager's salary. And now his own daughter thought he was imagining things. The realization struck with unexpected force. If Julie didn't believe him, who would? A respected executive against a retired accountant. A poised, articulate woman against an aging husband. He could already imagine the sympathetic looks, the gentle suggestions that perhaps he was confused, stressed, misinterpreting normal business activities. Richard opened the wedding album he'd brought with him, a moment of sentimentality he now regretted. The happy couple staring back from 45 years ago seemed like strangers. Margaret in her simple white dress, him in his rented tuxedo. They'd had so little then, but it had felt like everything. The first tear fell onto the plastic-covered page before he could stop it. Then another, and another, until his vision blurred completely and his shoulders shook with the force of suppressed sobs. Here, alone in a park where no one knew him, Richard finally released the tight control he'd maintained. The betrayal, the deception, the humiliation, all of it crashed over him in waves that left him gasping. Decades of trust shattered. A future he'd planned for, suddenly uncertain. The dignity he'd always maintained, stripped away by a hotel receipt and a hidden credit card. Has betrayal ever left you feeling alone and powerless? Share your story in the comments, like if Richard's pain touches your heart. Follow to discover if he finds the strength to fight back. The wedding album slipped from his lap, landing open on the ground. Richard bent to retrieve it, noticing as he did a paper that had fallen from between its pages, a receipt he'd placed there as evidence. But something was different. In the direct sunlight, he could clearly see what had been invisible under his desk lamp, a watermark on the paper that didn't match standard bank statements. He stared at it, tears forgotten as his analytical mind engaged. The receipt was a forgery, professionally done, but a forgery nonetheless, which meant either the charges were entirely fabricated or, more likely, they'd been altered to hide something worse. As he carefully examined the other documents, a shadow fell across the page. Richard looked up to find an older woman watching him with concern. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked gently. Richard quickly wiped his eyes with his handkerchief, embarrassed to be caught in such a state. "Yes, thank you. Just reviewing some old memories." She nodded with the understanding of someone who'd lived long enough to know about difficult memories, then continued her walk. Richard gathered his materials with renewed purpose. If Margaret was altering financial records, this went beyond an affair. This was fraud, possibly embezzlement. The professional implications were as serious as the personal ones. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Working late again. Don't wait up." Of course she was. As Richard stood to leave, he noticed something fall from his folder, a small business card. Picking it up, he recognized it immediately. Grace Carlyle, marketing director, Adam's wife, whom he'd met briefly at a company function years ago. She'd given Margaret her card, which had somehow ended up in Richard's files. He stared at it for a long moment, a new idea forming. If anyone had as much reason to investigate as he did, it would be her. Richard carefully placed the card in his wallet. He'd been looking at this all wrong. Julie's dismissal wasn't a setback. It was a clarification. This wasn't about convincing others or seeking sympathy. This was about justice, both personal and professional. And perhaps he'd just found his most valuable ally. "Mr. Harmon, I wasn't sure I'd hear from you." Grace Carlyle's voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. "You mentioned something about consolidated financial records." Richard sat in his car outside the small cafe where they'd agreed to meet, gathering his thoughts. The call to Adam's wife had been difficult to make, but her quick agreement to meet had surprised him. "Yes," he replied carefully. "I believe we may have some mutual concerns." A pause. 15 minutes, she said finally. The cafe was deliberately chosen, 30 miles from their neighborhood, unlikely to be frequented by anyone from Consolidated or their social circle. Richard arrived first, selecting a corner table with a view of the entrance. When Grace Carlyle walked in precisely on time, he recognized her immediately from company photographs, though they'd only met briefly years ago. She was younger than Margaret, early 40s perhaps, but carried herself with the same professional confidence. Her handshake was firm as she took the seat across from him, declining his offer of coffee. "I appreciate your discretion," she began without preamble. "I assume this is about Adam and your wife." The directness caught Richard off guard. "You know?" A tight smile crossed her face. "For about 6 months now. Credit card statements, late nights, weekend conferences. The usual signs." There was no emotion in her voice, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing an unpleasant business matter. Richard found himself both impressed and unsettled by her composure. "I'm sorry," he offered, the words inadequate even as he spoke them. "Don't be. What I'm interested in is what you mentioned on the phone, financial irregularities at Consolidated." She leaned forward slightly. "That's something altogether different." Richard carefully placed his folder on the table between them. Project Mayfair, Adam's project, with Margaret as budget approver. I've found evidence suggesting they've been using company funds to finance their activities. Grace's eyes narrowed. Show me. For the next 40 minutes, they reviewed his findings together. Richard explained the pattern he'd uncovered: inflated budget allocations, fabricated expenditure reports, and most damning, the altered financial statements he'd discovered in the park. They've been clever, he concluded, using legitimate business activities as cover, but skimming funds for personal use. The Mayflower Hotel charges appear on both company records and our personal account, with different amounts. Grace studied the documents, her marketing background belying a sharp financial mind. Double billing, she said finally. Charging the company for the full amount, then splitting the difference. Exactly. Richard felt a surge of validation. Unlike Julie, Grace immediately understood the implications. The question is, how extensive is it? I may be able to help with that. Grace opened her tablet, pulling up files with practiced efficiency. After I discovered the affair, I started paying closer attention to Adam's work. I have access to marketing expenditure reports that might correlate with your findings. She turned the screen toward Richard, showing a spreadsheet of marketing expenses for Project Mayfair. See these promotional events? They align perfectly with the weekends you've identified. Richard felt a familiar clarity emerging through the emotional fog, the satisfaction of numbers aligning, patterns revealing themselves. This was what he'd done for decades: follow the money to find the truth. They're using the marketing budget to cover their tracks, he said, connecting the dots. Promotional events that never happened, vendor payments that went elsewhere. And if they're doing this with Project Mayfair, Grace began. They could be doing it with other projects, Richard finished. This could be systematic. For the first time, a flash of emotion crossed Grace's composed features. Anger, quickly controlled. I built my career on my reputation, she said quietly. If Adam's activities trigger an investigation, everyone connected to these projects will be scrutinized. Richard understood immediately. This wasn't just about marital betrayal anymore. It was about professional integrity, reputations built over decades, financial security threatened by others' unethical choices. What do you suggest? He asked. Grace closed her tablet decisively. We need more evidence, specific, irrefutable proof that can't be dismissed as confusion or misunderstanding. The slight emphasis on those words suggested she'd encountered similar dismissal. I've been gathering what I can, Richard admitted, but I'm limited in what I can access. I'm not, Grace replied with grim determination. Between my marketing oversight and your financial expertise, we can build a comprehensive case. For the first time in weeks, Richard felt something like hope. A path forward emerging from the darkness of betrayal. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. He had an ally who understood both the personal and professional stakes. There's one more thing, Grace added, reaching into her purse. She removed a small device and placed it on the table. Adam's phone backs up automatically to our home computer. These are text messages between him and Margaret for the past 3 months. I thought you should see them. Richard stared at the device, his throat tightening. Part of him didn't want to know the intimate details of their betrayal. Another part knew he needed the complete truth. Some are personal, Grace warned, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. But others discuss the financial arrangements explicitly. That's what matters now. Richard nodded, taking the device with steady hands that belied his inner turmoil. Thank you for this. For all of this. Don't thank me, Grace replied, gathering her things. This isn't about helping each other. It's about protecting ourselves. As she stood to leave, Richard saw, beyond her composed exterior, to the pain she too was managing. Different from his, perhaps, given their different life stages, but pain nonetheless. "Grace," he said quietly, "regardless of the motivation, I'm grateful not to be fighting this battle alone." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Harmon. I'll email you what I find." Driving home, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The evidence was mounting, the case building. With Grace's help, he could prove what was happening, not just to Julie, but to the authorities if necessary. In his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of himself, straighter shoulders, clearer eyes than he'd seen in weeks. The pain hadn't diminished, but it had transformed into something purposeful. Margaret wasn't just betraying their marriage. She was betraying her professional ethics, her legal obligations, her entire career. And Richard, with 40 years of accounting expertise, was uniquely qualified to expose it all. For the first time since finding that hotel receipt, Richard allowed himself a small, grim smile. Margaret had always underestimated him, treating his precision as fussiness, his attention to detail as a quirk rather than a skill. She wouldn't make that mistake again. The law office of Samuel Reed projected exactly the impression it intended: success, discretion, and quiet authority. Leather-bound volumes lined mahogany shelves, certificates hung in tasteful frames, and the downtown view suggested clients paid handsomely for the privilege of this representation. Richard straightened his tie as he waited, the leather portfolio containing weeks of evidence resting on his lap. The receptionist had offered him coffee, which sat untouched on the side table. His stomach couldn't handle it. Not today. "Mr. Harmon?" Samuel Reed appeared in the doorway, younger than Richard had expected, but with the confidence of experience. "Please come in." Has betrayal forced you to fight for what's rightfully yours? Share your journey in the comments, like if you're standing with Richard. Follow to witness justice unfold. Richard followed him into a corner office where Grace Carlyle already sat waiting. Their alliance had proven remarkably effective over the past week. Her inside access combined with his financial expertise, creating a comprehensive picture of the fraud being perpetrated. "Thank you for seeing us together," Richard said, taking the offered seat. "Mrs. Carlyle and I believe our situations are connected in ways that warrant a coordinated approach." Reed nodded, his expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Carlyle has briefed me on the broad strokes. I understand we're dealing with both marital infidelity and potential financial misconduct." "Potential is putting it mildly," Grace interjected, her composed exterior showing rare cracks of emotion. "We have documented evidence of systematic fraud." Richard opened his portfolio, laying out the case they'd built together. Bank statements showing the double billing scheme, text messages between Margaret and Adam explicitly discussing fund diversions, marketing expenditure reports for events that never occurred, company credit card statements with personal charges disguised as business expenses. "The pattern extends beyond Project Mayfair," Richard explained, his voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath. "We've identified at least 3 other projects with similar irregularities, spanning approximately 18 months. Reed reviewed the documents carefully, asking occasional clarifying questions that revealed his quick grasp of complex financial matters. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted from neutral to grimly determined. "Mr. Harmon, Mrs. Carlyle, you've compiled a remarkable case here. This goes well beyond a private marital matter. This is fraud, potentially embezzlement, with clear documentation." "What are our options?" Grace asked, ever practical. Reed leaned back, fingers steepled. "Several, depending on your priorities. From a purely legal standpoint, this evidence would support both divorce proceedings and criminal charges. Consolidated would almost certainly terminate their employment once this comes to light. Criminal charges. The words hung in the air, heavier than Richard had anticipated. Despite everything, the thought of Margaret facing legal consequences created a complicated knot of emotions he wasn't prepared to untangle. "I don't want to see my wife in jail," he said quietly, surprising himself. "I want what's fair, our assets protected, the truth acknowledged. But not—" "Understandable," Reed nodded. "And that gives us some negotiating leverage. Mrs. Carlyle?" "I want Adam removed from any position that could damage my professional reputation by association," she replied without hesitation, "and appropriate compensation for his financial misconduct. Beyond that, I have no interest in his fate." Reed made notes, then outlined a strategy. Formal letters to Margaret and Adam separately, detailing the evidence and proposing settlements that would avoid criminal charges while ensuring just compensation and clean breaks. "And if they refuse?" Richard asked, the question that had kept him awake for nights. "Then we proceed with divorce filings and simultaneously present the evidence to Consolidated's board and legal department," Reed answered. "They'll have their own obligation to consider criminal charges at that point." As the meeting concluded, with plans for the letters to be delivered within days, Reed asked to speak with Richard privately. Grace nodded her understanding, arranging to meet later to discuss next steps. When the door closed behind her, Reed's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Mr. Harmon, I've handled many divorce cases in my career. Few clients maintain the composure you've shown while presenting such evidence." Richard glanced down at his hands, steady despite everything. 40 years as an accountant," he said simply. "Numbers don't lie, even when people do." "Still," Reed continued, "this will become more difficult, not less, when your wife receives our letter. Are you prepared for that?" The question struck deeper than Richard expected. Was he prepared to face Margaret's reaction? The denial, the accusations, perhaps even pleas for forgiveness? "I don't know," he admitted. 45 years is a long time to share with someone. I thought I knew her." Reed nodded, understanding in his eyes. "In my experience, Mr. Harmon, people often show their truest selves not during the marriage, but during its dissolution. Be prepared for that." Leaving the office, Richard paused at the elevator, catching his reflection in the polished brass doors. The man looking back seemed older than he remembered, lines etched deeper around his eyes, but his posture remained straight, his gaze clear. Margaret had texted earlier, "Dinner at Giovanni's tonight. My treat." The casual normalcy of it struck him as almost surreal. By tomorrow, she would receive Reed's letter. The carefully maintained fiction of their marriage would shatter completely. Giovanni's had been their special occasion restaurant for decades, fitting perhaps for what would be their final dinner together. "Yes," he texted back. "See you at 7. As the elevator descended, Richard felt a curious sense of calm replacing the turmoil of recent weeks. The investigation had given him purpose, the evidence had given him certainty, and somehow, in the process of documenting Margaret's betrayal, he had reclaimed something he hadn't realized he'd lost: his confidence, his agency, his sense of self beyond husband. Whatever happened next, he would face it standing tall. The Consolidated Financial Services boardroom had always intimidated visitors with its deliberate grandeur: gleaming tables stretching 20 feet, leather chairs for 18 executives, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Richard and Margaret had called home for 5 decades. Today, that grandeur felt like a theater stage, set for the final act of a drama no one had anticipated. Richard sat beside Samuel Reed, their matching charcoal suits creating a united front across from Margaret, Adam, and their hastily retained counsel. At the head of the table, Harold Winters, Consolidated's CEO, presided with the grave expression of a man confronting an unexpected crisis. Flanking him were the company's legal counsel, HR director, and chief financial officer. Grace Carlyle sat further down, her position deliberately separate from both parties, a witness rather than an active participant in this particular confrontation. "Let's be clear about why we're here," Winters began, his voice carrying the controlled authority that had guided Consolidated for 15 years. "Serious allegations of financial misconduct have been brought to our attention with substantial documentation. This meeting is to address these allegations before determining next steps." Margaret's eyes hadn't left Richard's face since they'd entered. Her initial shock at receiving Reed's letter had quickly transformed into cold fury, then desperate negotiation attempts, and finally this, a tense standoff where her career and reputation hung in the balance. "My client categorically denies any intentional wrongdoing," Margaret's attorney stated. "Any irregularities in financial reporting were clerical errors that—" "Clerical errors?" Richard couldn't help the incredulous tone. "Systematically occurring across multiple projects for 18 months? Reed placed a calming hand on Richard's arm before addressing the room. "We've provided extensive documentation demonstrating a pattern of deliberate financial manipulation. Hotel expenses double-billed to the company and personal accounts. Events that never occurred but were fully funded. Vendor payments to shell companies that ultimately routed funds back to personal accounts." The CFO nodded grimly. "Our preliminary internal audit confirms these findings. The pattern is undeniable." "And the personal relationship between Mrs. Harmon and Mr. Carlyle?" Winters asked, addressing the elephant in the room. "Irrelevant to the financial allegations," Margaret's attorney attempted. "Except that their text messages explicitly discuss the manipulation of company funds," Reed countered, sliding copies of the messages across the table. Page 4, third exchange down, where Mrs. Harmon suggests using the Westlake Conference as cover for their Poconos weekend. Page 7, where Mr. Carlyle confirms diverting vendor payments to a separate account. Adam Carlyle stared at the documents, his face ashen. Unlike Margaret, he'd made no attempt to contact Grace after receiving Reed's letter, perhaps recognizing the futility given the evidence she possessed. "These messages were obtained illegally," Margaret's attorney protested. "Actually," Grace spoke for the first time, her voice steady, "they were obtained from a computer in my home, to which I have legal access as the registered owner. The courts have consistently upheld that spouses have no reasonable expectation of privacy on shared devices." Richard watched Margaret's face as the reality of her situation became increasingly clear. The careful facade she'd maintained, respected executive, community volunteer, devoted wife, was crumbling before a room of her peers. Her eyes, when they met his, held something he'd never seen there before: fear. "Mr. Harmon," Winters addressed him directly, "I understand you're pursuing divorce proceedings separately from this matter?" "Yes," Richard confirmed, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "Although the financial misconduct certainly informs those proceedings." "And criminal charges?" The question hung in the air. Richard glanced at Margaret, 45 years of shared life flashing through his mind in an instant. Birthday celebrations, vacation photographs, hospital vigils when Julie was born, quiet evenings on the porch, all real, all now shadowed by betrayal. "That would depend on the outcome of this meeting," Reed answered carefully. "My client's primary concern is that the financial damage be addressed and his assets protected from further misappropriation." Winters nodded, exchanging glances with his legal team before making his decision. "Here's how we'll proceed. Mrs. Harmon, Mr. Carlyle, your employment with Consolidated is terminated, effective immediately. You'll surrender all company property before leaving the building. Your retirement benefits will be adjusted to account for the documented misappropriation of funds." Margaret began to protest, but her attorney quieted her with a warning touch. "Additionally," Winters continued, "Consolidated will file a formal report with the Financial Crimes Division. Whether that results in criminal prosecution will be at their discretion, though we will cooperate fully with any investigation." The pronouncement fell like a gavel. Margaret's shoulders slumped slightly, the first genuine physical reaction Richard had seen from her throughout the meeting. "Mr. Harmon, Mrs. Carlyle," Winters turned to them, "Consolidated appreciates your bringing this matter to our attention. It's regrettable that personal relationships were damaged in the process. The understatement might have been almost funny in another context." As the meeting concluded, Margaret attempted to approach Richard, but Reed smoothly intercepted, guiding him toward the door with a murmured reminder about their next appointment. In the elevator, Richard finally allowed himself a deep breath, the tension of the confrontation releasing its grip on his chest. "You did well in there," Reed commented. "Many clients find themselves overcome in such situations." Richard nodded, not entirely trusting his voice. The victory felt hollow in some ways, necessary in others. He hadn't wanted to destroy Margaret, only to protect himself from further harm, to establish the truth, to reclaim what was rightfully his. As they reached the lobby, Grace joined them, her professional composure intact despite the emotional weight of the proceedings. "The divorce settlements should proceed smoothly now," Reed told them both. "Their negotiating position has been significantly weakened. I'd anticipate favorable terms without court appearances." "Thank you," Grace said simply, extending her hand to Richard. "For your thoroughness, your expertise made this possible." Richard shook her hand, recognizing in her the same complex emotions he felt. Vindication without joy, resolution without celebration. "What will you do now?" he asked her. A small, determined smile crossed her face. "Focus on my career. My life is still ahead of me, after all." The reminder of their different life stages struck Richard as they parted ways outside the building. Grace would rebuild, her professional reputation intact, decades of possibility before her. His own future felt less certain. Victory secured, but its meaning still unclear. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed with a text from Julie. "Dad, can we talk? Mom called me crying." Richard paused, the bright spring day suddenly bringing everything into sharper focus. The office workers hurrying past, a couple laughing at an outdoor cafe, an elderly man walking his dog with deliberate care. Life continuing, changing, moving forward. "Yes," he replied to his daughter. "There's a lot to explain." Dinner tonight. Sometimes vindication came with unexpected costs. But as Richard drove away from Consolidated for what would likely be the last time, he felt something he hadn't expected, not triumph, but peace. The truth had been his most powerful ally, and now it was finally, irrevocably known. The porch swing creaked gently as Richard pushed against the floorboards with his toe, a rhythm as familiar as his own heartbeat. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at Consolidated. Summer had arrived, bringing longer evenings and the sweet scent of neighbor Colin's magnolia blossoms drifting over the fence. The house behind him, his house now solely, had undergone subtle transformations. Margaret's carefully arranged decorative pillows were gone from the couch, replaced by a single, comfortable throw. The formal dining room had been converted to a reading space with his favorite chair and the books he'd always kept in his office. Small changes that made the familiar space truly his own. Richard sipped his evening tea, watching fireflies begin their nightly display across the lawn. The divorce had finalized last week, with terms that reflected the strength of his position, the house, the majority of their savings, his full pension. Margaret had moved to Philadelphia, closer to her sister, starting over at 65 with significantly diminished circumstances. He felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a complicated blend of emotions that had gradually settled into something like peace. The gate latch clicked, drawing his attention to Julie making her way up the garden path, a covered dish in her hands. Their relationship had weathered its own storm after the truth emerged, her initial disbelief giving way to shocked acceptance, then guilt over having dismissed his concerns. "Lasagna," she announced, climbing the porch steps. "Brian made extra, though from the smell of things, you've already got dinner going." Richard nodded toward the kitchen. "Pot roast in the slow cooker, your grandmother's recipe." Julie set her dish on the small table and settled into the chair beside the swing. "You're cooking again. That's good." "Small steps," he acknowledged. The first weeks after Margaret's departure, he'd subsisted mainly on sandwiches and delivery, lacking both energy and motivation for proper meals. "I'm relearning old habits, remembering what I enjoy." Cooking had always been his domain before retirement, though Margaret had claimed the kitchen afterward. Reclaiming it felt symbolic somehow, another piece of himself recovered. "The kids are asking when they can come for a sleepover," Julie said, watching him carefully. The grandchildren had been kept somewhat sheltered from the full truth, told only that their grandparents had decided to live separately. "I'd like that," Richard replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Maybe next weekend. We could set up the tent in the backyard." Julie smiled, relief evident in her expression. "They'd love that. They miss you." "I've missed them too," he admitted. The early weeks after the confrontation had been a blur of legal meetings, financial reorganization, and profound exhaustion that had left little energy for family connections. It's time to change that. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the swing's gentle creaking a counterpoint to distant neighborhood sounds, a lawnmower, children's voices, a car door closing. Life continuing its ordinary rhythm. "Dad," Julie began tentatively, "have you thought about what comes next? I mean longer term." Richard considered the question, one he'd been asking himself with increasing frequency. "Actually, I have. Finn called yesterday with an interesting proposition." "Oh?" Julie's eyebrows raised. "His firm occasionally needs consulting work on financial forensics, fraud investigations, essentially. Given my recent experience, he thought I might be interested in part-time work." "And are you?" Richard nodded, surprised by his own enthusiasm. "I think I am, using my skills to help others who've been deceived. There's something fitting about that." The irony wasn't lost on him. Margaret's betrayal, meant to diminish him, had instead revealed strengths he'd forgotten he possessed. His meticulous nature, his analytical mind, his attention to detail, qualities she'd often subtly mocked, had ultimately protected him and could now help others. "That's wonderful, Dad." Julie reached over to squeeze his hand. "You've seemed more Yourself these past few weeks. More than you have in years, actually. Richard understood what she meant. Somewhere in the comfortable routine of retirement, in the familiar patterns of a decades-long marriage, he'd gradually diminished, becoming less himself, more an extension of their shared identity. The painful separation had forced him to rediscover who Richard Harmon was when standing alone. "I joined that senior center book club Mrs. Patterson kept inviting me to," he added. "And I've been thinking about that trip to Yellowstone I always wanted to take." Julie's smile widened. "Solo adventure?" "Perhaps," he chuckled. Though Finn mentioned he might be interested, two old bachelors on the road, God help the park rangers. The joke felt good, natural in a way laughter hadn't for months. The heaviness that had settled in his chest since finding that first hotel receipt had not disappeared entirely, but it had lightened, making space for other emotions to emerge. As twilight deepened into evening, Richard poured a second cup of tea and showed Julie the brochures he'd collected for Yellowstone. They discussed dates for the grandchildren's visit, a community theater production Julie was involved with, and the pot roast recipe simmering in the kitchen. Ordinary conversations, family matters, life continuing. Later, after Julie had gone home with promises to bring the children soon, Richard returned to the porch swing with the framed photograph he'd taken from the mantel, their 40th anniversary celebration. The family gathered around them, smiling. He studied Margaret's face, searching for signs of the deception that would begin soon after, finding none. Perhaps that was the most difficult lesson, that love, even love sustained over decades, was no guarantee against betrayal. That trust, once broken, left permanent fractures. That starting over was possible at any age, but carried both sorrow and liberation in equal measure. Richard carefully returned the photograph to a cardboard box waiting by the door, not discarded, but no longer needing prominent display. Their shared history remained a part of him, but it no longer defined his future. The night had fully arrived now, fireflies creating constellations across the darkened lawn. From next door came the faint sound of Old Man Collins playing his vinyl records, a weekend ritual as reliable as sunrise. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the gentle motion of the swing, the summer breeze against his face, the weight of his own body settling into this moment of quiet solitude. At 68, he had discovered an unexpected truth. Endings, even painful ones, created space for new beginnings. Tomorrow, he would call Finn about the consulting position. Next weekend, he would welcome his grandchildren with tent adventures and pancake breakfasts. In the fall, perhaps, Yellowstone would await with its ancient wonders. For tonight, this porch, this moment of hard-won peace, was enough.